All right, so as Delmar was talking about the rationale behind building LibreTexts, um, I joined the project 6 years ago, and my background and my PhD was in how to design a textbook that doesn't just have the standard format that textbooks have always had. So rethinking about how the textbook could work. I did that work at UW-Madison with John Moore, and we implemented an online textbook into, I think, Del, you're still unmuted. Typing, perfect. All right. And we did that work with a general chemistry class and tried to think about how do people actually use textbooks? Because before you try to think about how to move something into a new media, you should think about how people are actually utilizing them right now to learn. So along those lines, I'm going to talk about that today. So we're going to talk a little bit today in depth about how to think about textbooks and what to think about your courses, and then how LibreText functions and works and operates and what's available. And then we'll go into more details tomorrow about course management, interactivity, and the advanced features that you can embed along the way. So that's the link right there you guys have in your email. If you did want to participate in social media and make comments, we are using LibreFest 2020 as our hashtag and generically LibreText. So feel free to do that. I think maybe Jennifer has already even posted something about the fact that we're starting already. But feel free to tag us so we know what the communication's going on. So back to my talk, rethinking the textbook and advantages of online texts. Obviously, we would love to make things cheaper for students, and that's the driving force originally. But why not make something that actually helps our students to learn better with a different medium? So there's a lot of learning materials that you can use to learn anything in our classes or outside our classes. There's the traditional lecture style delivery. There's news websites. There's also just reading a textbook of some sort or some other book or novel. For instance, even textbooks you can learn from regular books too, the stories of letters. All these things are ways that you could learn from some written material or spoken material, and they have their different advantages. When you gain understanding from a textbook, we're used to the same structure of chapters, units, and sections. There's some narrative that goes through there, and that story or narration that the author gives it has some sort of voice to help students to understand what things are going through. There's also possibility that the textbook gives students motivation, story problems, things that bring in real world context, examples from the real world or example problems, and then makes connections to outside of the class in some sort of way, shape, or form, or within the textbook. Remember, there's appendices and tables of contents and all of these learning objectives that we stick into the textbook these days. So these things are really how a textbook has been designed to be a platform for learning. And textbooks started off as a book, right? Like they were a book. They didn't have all these fancy features, and they've been evolving in time as we've used them. But there was a time we learned before textbooks as well. And textbooks have been studied a lot, way more than you might think they've been studied. So for instance, there's an article here that says you should read the whole entire textbook before your class even starts. And there's been studies on whether or not people even use textbooks. There's studies on study habits and misconceptions between things. There's been studies as far back as 1975, an unobtrusive measure to study textbook use on whether or not they use it. And that study is actually quite hilarious. What they did was they took a spot of glue and glued every single page together in the whole textbook. And they gathered all the textbooks every single week and counted the number of pages that the glue dot had been broken to see how many pages students actually read during that week. And it turns out that was done here in Eastern Michigan. It turns out that people don't really read very much. Glue seal's broken. Around 2 to 3 pages per chapter were broken throughout the course of the period. And you can tell that there's something like reviewing old material here, so they didn't break any new pages. And then they broke a bunch of new pages the first day after the test, but then it drops off again. So they're only breaking 2 to 3 pages. That's back in 1975. I think our students, you might argue, read even less than they used to because now there's the internet to go find things. So there's been a lot of research into textbook usage. The project that I worked on back at University of Wisconsin-Madison had 2 different lectures that used a hard copy textbook and then one that used an online text. And I measured whether or not they use something either not at all or more than any other source. So that's the 1 to 6 range here. So you can see in the 2 hard copy textbooks here, people said that they actually use the textbook quite a bit. One tech class that used the hard copy a lot, one hard copy used it not that much, and of course the online textbook class didn't use the hard copy hardly at all. And here's an interesting thing. Did you use any textbook other than the one that you were assigned? A lot of professors like to give additional resources that people would like to maybe look at. No one uses any of those. So this is for a general chemistry course. Here's an interesting thing that publishing companies would probably not like you to know. Oops, back one. The hard copy textbook had a DVD or a CD-ROM or some online materials that are interactive to help you learn. How often did you use those? Not at all, not at all, not at all. And that could have been assigned or not assigned. So students, a lot of textbook publishers are trying to make things interactive and engaging, and students just simply do not use them. So there's a lot of money and cost that goes into that that's just not being utilized. In fact, if you look at how often people used it, you find that students really rarely don't use the textbook hardly at all. So the ChemPaths is the online one. They might have, 50% of them chose to use the online one. Some chose to use some, and then neither. 20% of the class decided to use neither book at all. And in fact, very little people, there's a lot of people here, about a third of the class, that decided to hardly use the textbook at all. I'm not doing this to disparage the use of textbooks. Obviously, I think textbooks are useful, but I want to emphasize that people might have a misconception in their head about how much their students actually pick up the textbook that they're assigning, right? Where do you use it? Well, people use it at home. They don't use it in lab or lecture. They use it a little bit while traveling. They use it a lot in their study locations. So that's not too bad. In fact, it's about the same between people who use hard copy books and online textbooks. Only thing that's a little bit different is hard copy book gets used a little bit more online. This is back in 2011. That probably has changed as well. Okay, so pretty much the usage gets to be about the same. So moving things online doesn't really change students' study behaviors at all. But the one thing that does change a lot is the cost. And Delmar talked quite a bit about this, so I'm not going to go into it very detailed, but I don't think you used this graph. This one shows that textbooks rise way faster than anything else over time. Since 1980, these are the trends. Textbooks didn't rise that much more than even medical services, but we're at 800% growth in 2012 from what it was before. So textbook costs are moving up quite a bit, largely because of they cornered the market, as Delmar said. But really, this is an outstanding amount of burden that you're putting on your students. So what can we do to make this cheaper resource of using open educational resources better and more effective? And the research that you would use online is more about mental images. So this is a difference between how you would think about a textbook itself and how you would think about navigating in general. So for instance, I used to live in the Virgin Islands. That's a picture from the top of one of the hills there. And this picture is actually from right about here. Up here is this hill. And there's it's a place called Four Corners right around here where people move between different roads at the top of this mountain. And it's interesting because none of these roads actually have names. So no one has an address that's related to their actual road they live on. They're just told their house number 5 in this general area. So there's no way to navigate the way that you're used to. Instead, they navigate by landmarks. So for instance, the common description that was given to me when I moved there was, you go up the hill to where the big tree used to be before Hurricane Marilyn. I lived there in 2011. And Hurricane Marilyn was in 1982, I believe. So they were referencing a hurricane that happened 30 years before as being someplace I should know. And actually, I do know where that tree used to be because you had to know it. Otherwise, you could never get any directions. So this is an idea of using landmarks to navigate. And this is how online learning really should be thought of. For instance, this picture right here from our Moodle platform at Hope College. This thing here is 3 bars. At some point, someone had to tell you what that was. But at this point in your life, you probably know what 3 bars means. It means that's where you go to find their menu. That's where you go to expand to find other options. Over here, there's a gear. That gear there doesn't need to be explained anymore. It's an icon. It's something that helps you to figure out where you're located in space, in this virtual world space. So, and then this right here is called breadcrumbs, which you might have known. These things are all navigational techniques that center people in the online world. How do you center yourself and see the information around you? How do you get new information? So this is just a difference in paradigm between how a textbook works and between how navigation online works. It's how our brains are functioning and how our students are navigating through things. So to think about this framework for how you would design material online, it's not enough to just think about taking a PDF and just sticking it online. There's other things to think about. And one thing that I've worked on in the past is this framework called content, architecture, and pedagogy. So if you have the link to the LibreTexts page, I put a link to where this framework is located right here. And I will show you where that is. If you're on the LibreFest 2020 page, which I can just put, Brent, do you want to put a link in the chat box since I have trouble finding the chat box while I'm talking? But everyone should probably have this somewhere up already. And if you look at there, there's a link to the framework right there. That doesn't take you away from LibreTexts at all. It just takes you to the workshop materials on this framework, which I'm not going to go through all of it, but I do want to go through a couple things that will be helpful for you. I'm going to start talking about the framework here, and you can find most of the information that I'm going to talk about here inside of this area. Okay, so the content, architecture, and pedagogy really focuses on the overlap of different things to think about when you're trying to design for online learning. Content is biology or chemistry or your psychology 100 class. Whatever the content is for that material that you're thinking about has some sort of structure by itself. But there's also the architecture of the website and the web pages themselves. And that needs to be thought about, like that navigation from on top of the hill, the tree where the place where the tree used to be. Those landmarks are things that dictate the architecture and the organization. And architecture can actually help you explain your content better. By organizing things well, you can then make the content connections more clear. And then pedagogy plays a role across a lot of these things. Maybe there's pedagogical approaches to how to teach your content, but there's also pedagogical approaches to how you should organize your class or how you should organize your textbook. And that's really where a lot of my work has gone into. Accessibility is a big one, but accessibility doesn't just talk about different abilities of your students, but also exploring how well is it for students to explore new things? How is it well for them to orient? Orientation would be something like, I know I need to read 3 pages today because she said 3 pages, but I don't know where those 3 pages are or where to find those 3 pages. How do you orient yourself in that virtual space? Content. That's probably the thing that we're going to spend the least amount of time talking about because you guys are content experts. You know more about your content than I ever will. But you should never think about your content as being separate from how you're presenting it, right? How you organize it is the architecture. All right, oops, there we go. When architecture and pedagogy overlap, that's talking about how would you lay out that page to contribute to effective learning. Maybe units or weeks or days can have their divisions rather than chapters and sections. Maybe you're going to divide your class by quiz material or by test material instead of having chapter 1 and half of chapter 2 on this next test. There's the course architecture overall can actually build that help for your students to reduce that load. There's also a lot of things that I'm not going to talk about specifically, but I want to expose you to. If you know people in your area that do discipline-based education research, so biology education or physics education or English education, those people can be great sources of information for how to make your content better described. So for instance, adding images, of course, should be useful for about anybody. How are you going to have multimedia? Make your multimedia complementary to material, not redundant to your material. In chemistry, Wu and Shah has 5 design principles that help teach chemistry. So I encourage you, if you want to go into more detail later on, to look into your own discipline-based education area. Okay. But there's a lot of other things that are shared across the field. So for instance, making visible linked connections. This is really important. We've done a lot of research into this. If you don't tell a student why a link exists, they will never click on that link. If you don't explain how something will lead to something else, then they will frequently skip over certain chapters of your, or certain sections of your page. Hypertext learning. This whole idea of navigating them in their virtual space. Where should they go next? How should they get there? What are the landmarks they need to do? If they get overwhelmed and confused, where do they go to feel like they know what they're doing? So scaffolding, hypertext, making sure people can see connections. These are all really important, and they're much better done online, to be honest. It's much easier to get students to make connections when it's a click away rather than go see page 52. Students are very likely to do that. So going through these, I've also added into that online material some questions you can ask that will really get at it, because it's easier to ask yourself questions than it is to just say, okay, I learned a lot about how things should be connected, but I don't know what that means. So for content, make sure you know what your learning objectives are for the course. How many are you going to teach in a given lecture, in a given exam period? What conceptual links between the material are important for your students to understand? So what concept links do you want, not just facts? What depth does a concept need to be covered? Figure out what depth you're going to go into on a certain page. That's one of the biggest things that LibreTexts can really be great for. You can find the same topic, for instance, in chemistry, covered at a 100 level or a 300 level, or possibly even a graduate level. What depth do you want? Maybe you need to rewrite it so it is the correct depth. How are you going to assess your content? Of course, you should always think about how you're going to be grading your students and giving them points, or however you mark up your assessment. And of course, think about sample problems or questions along the way. So those are content questions, but there's also architecture and pedagogy questions. How many learning objectives are you going to stick on one single web page? How long is that page going to be? If things are connected, should they be covered at the same time, or should you cover them on 2 different pages hyperlinked together? How integrated do you want your syllabus to be? Do you want an online course manager to detail each learning objective you have? Or do you want that to be on your syllabus where people go back to that every time? Should your syllabus be part of your textbook? How do you organize a single page? Where should you put your pictures? Where should you put your videos? How do people interact with those? And I think this bolded one on the end is one of the most important ones to remember at all times, because as professors who have seen the exact same material 20 times, we can get a little bored, and adding a little complexity may sound like fun to you. But make sure you ask this question. Are you including something because it can be included, or because it helps learning? So in other words, don't stick in 4 extra videos because all of them give a slightly different nuanced approach to a material. Maybe figure out which one really hits the learning objective that you want in the best way, and include that in a novel way. So with all the cool, excellent features we have, we still want to think about how to use those effectively to increase student learning. So in LibreTexts, there's a bunch of different ways you could do this. You could have one page that has your chapters in sections and links to every single one. Excuse me. I call this the most bare bones and easy one to do. It has links here to other LibreTexts pages, and then it has some links to outside pages so that people could go to other websites if you found interesting things. And I think that most people could easily build one of these relatively quickly. But maybe it's a little bit better for you to separate your material by lecture. So you want to be able to have students feel a little bit more at home about knowing what needs to be done on what days. So having the lectures with the dates, what readings and videos you want them to cover, perhaps what homework is going to be right there on LibreTexts as well, so that all these things together help a student to reduce the frustration of trying to navigate through learning and focus on learning the material that you want presented. There's also more diagramical ways. You could have it where your class actually has agendas and homework, slideshows from your lecture. Then you could separate your material by different units so it's easy to get to. This is not necessarily a textbook. It's kind of a hybrid between a course management system and a textbook. But really, that's okay. Your students have fewer places to go, and it reduces that cognitive load of learning things together. One thing I really appreciated, this is one of Delmar Larson's pages. As he mentioned, he's been doing this for a long, long time. And in one way that we frequently joke is that I spent 4 years of my PhD trying to understand what the best way to organize material would be. And he spent 10 years trial and error and getting feedback from students. And we both arrived at the same place, which I think is great because that means the theory and the practice seem to support each other quite well. This is an example from his class. He has a daily lecture with a topic, a quick little overview of what his objective is to teach that day, what readings he's going to be covering, what homework is going to be assigned, and any practice worksheets that are there, and assumed knowledge, so a page that's not going to be covered in lecture, but would be assumed that you should already know before you got there that day. So this ties everything together within a learning objective for that lecture period, or possibly more than one learning objective, with some good information about that. This navigates a student into one specific place in their mind. I'm working on lecture 1, and here's all the things that have to do with that. So you can see already that there's a difference between each of these. And there are strengths and disadvantages to both, but there are different ways to think about what a textbook could be beyond just a set of PDFs. So the next thing on our schedule is to explore. A lot of you already did this as your pre-LibreFest assignment that I gave you, to go through and explore. I need to bring up the framework. Boom. So talking a little bit about this idea, explore around the textbooks, think about these different pages. As Delmar mentioned, there are courses that you can look at. So you can start to look at different people's courses from different colleges that have already built things to see how they organized it. Or you can look at other bookshelves of pre-made books. So these would be just typical textbooks themselves without any course organization put into them. They're just simply textbooks in some way. So you can take a look at those.